you have visited our channel. I believe that our meetings should be regular in the future because so many events are happening. And I think, in general, there should be more and more bloggers who advocate for libertarian ideas. And in fact, people who support such an idea are people of common sense who want real growth for their society. There's a normal relationship between the individual and the state, normal existence and the development of the economy, and most importantly, the cessation of war. Well, I believe that a very significant event took place on the 30th. I think it will go down in history. That's my opinion. Because practically the mechanism for stopping the war in the future and the development of Ukraine, together with America, has been set in motion, which we have always strongly desired. Perhaps our efforts, let's say as of today, can also be counted because we have long wanted a financial paradise for Ukraine. We wanted this so that society could develop normally and the state would not sell out its people in the future. I think that in alliance now with conservatives and libertarians, I believe that this mix currently in power, Diukun, will help Ukraine get back on its feet. Well, please share your opinion on this agreement.
The more I delve into this agreement and how it is being advanced, I remind you that it was signed on the 30th, and Stefanchuk, who is the head of parliament, inserted it into the parliamentary agenda already, late at night, 1 minute before midnight, to ensure that the first day would count, so that 7 days would pass. And on the 8th, they seemed to be planning to ratify it. And I noticed how all these bloggers, the positive Russians like Shari, the Porokobots, and then the Ironiacs of voice are howling in the swamps. In other words, pre-oligarchic creatures. And basically, they started raising a clamor about what a terrible deal it is, how the citizens of Ukraine were robbed, how all this will be. What did Ukraine fight for? The oligarchs speak with trembling anger because it's clear that it wasn't for their capital. And indeed, Ukraine has made a huge step forward in the sense that they finally broke Zelensky's resistance, because he too is not under God, but under the oligarchy. And in fact, they are persuading him, saying, don't do this under any circumstances because it will be the end for us. And when the details of this deal started to emerge, the most interesting part came out, that for 20 years we've been fighting with you over the fact that there should be a financial paradise, that taxes can be abolished. And all those unfinished USAID and other activists and state figures explain to us that this is impossible because the country won't survive. The country won't survive without the taxes. And suddenly I read, it turns out that this fund, which has practically grabbed all of Ukraine's resources, is effectively becoming tax-free. So, sometimes the ways of the Lord are mysterious. You don't understand where the tax exemption will come from. Firstly, it is registered in the state of Delaware. Secondly, all the courts will be there. Secondly, it is completely exempt from taxes for 10 years. So everything will be reinvested without taxes. Money will be withdrawn without taxes. And it's just astonishing because you realize that de facto, about half of the state budget, which was partly formed by oligarchs, remains without taxes. So in fact, they have given us a half tax-free Ukraine. And now the question is, do we have a party in parliament and ideas to make the whole of Ukraine tax-free? Because of course, as an entrepreneur, it would be upsetting for me and many people and ordinary citizens that you have implemented this tax-free status for the fund, which is good for the country's recovery. So it's obvious. Yes, any economist would say, abolish taxes and the population thrives. You can invest, you can work freely, it attracts investments. Any economist would simply say, these are foolish words. But to maintain power, it turns out taxes are needed. Well, to pressure people, to suppress them, to redistribute, to expand the state apparatus. And now our task is indeed to use this proof that it is possible to live without taxes, that life exists without taxes, that without taxes everyone will have more money and the state will be smaller. And the question arises, why do we need such a huge state if you have handed over resources to the management of the International Ukraine USA Fund? In other words, this will essentially trigger a chain reaction, and Ukraine will have to find a way to dispose of half of the state apparatus, which is de facto unnecessary. Partly due to the lost territories, some deputies will also have to be disposed of. And in fact, we arrive at a very good result in the sense that if the Axis 50 party, a libertarian one, somehow enters the Ukrainian parliament and holds a majority, it would be possible to form a tax-free government and essentially implement this idea, of a financial raid for 40 years.
Yes, to confirm your words, I would also like to say that Putin fought so fiercely against NATO that he ended up with America on his border, so to speak. Can we say it like that or not?
Absolutely, because people still don't fully understand the cunning plan of the United States of America. They write, that's it. The United States is withdrawing from, so to speak, the war. They are indeed withdrawing because the current task is to bring Zelensky and Putin to the negotiation table for direct talks. There, they have, I believe, disagreements on 22 points. And the United States of America says, these points we can no longer resolve for you. You need to sit down with delegations and make these 22 points acceptable through mutual concessions and stop the war. The main parameters are now included. And all of this has been included. And what have the United States of America actually done? By concluding an agreement with the government of Ukraine and also ratifying the agreement now before the end of the war, before these territories, which will remain under the control of the Russian Federation for some period, or they are rejected. Now they need to sign all of this before the negotiations, ratify it in parliament, and then the United States of America, together with Ukraine, will be the owners of all the resources, including those on the occupied territory. To understand that even if it remains under occupation, no one will extract resources there until all of this returns to Ukraine's jurisdiction. Because those resources, about 40% of them, are currently located in the occupied territory. In other words, the United States of America has hacked not only Ukraine's resources, but also the resources Putin was counting on after fighting for more than 3 years. And they explained to him, that's it. And of course, he will have a question within Russia. Why the hell did you fight, idiot? Why did you fight? Vova Oreshkin, or whatever his name is, Oreshnik, who breaks birdhouses. Did you even have any brains now that you've really got the United States of America in Ukraine? Ukraine is armed to the teeth with a capable army that can stop you. And most importantly, you still didn't get the resources. You got a headache in the form of Crimea, which will still be considered occupied in the international order, even if the United States of America recognizes it. That's how it was. You got something else. You now have to transform from a Slavophile into a Westerner. Well, because you say you love the USA, you love Donnie, you want to be friends with him. And what does it mean to be friends with Americans? It means you have to undergo restructuring at home, bringing in American companies. American companies don't thrive well under a dictatorship. And money doesn't thrive well under a dictatorship either. And that's why they need more freedom. And what does more freedom mean for any country? It's the death of a dictator, any dictator. Therefore, very interesting events await Russians in connection with their friendship with America.
I would also say that there are historical examples where America stepped in and started helping other countries, like the example of Lend-Lease and the Marshall Plan. I would even say that right now this plan, at the moment from Trump's team, is some kind of mix, possibly even of Lend-Lease, and the Marshall Plan. That is, well, there's never been such a proposal before, for example. This means that, well, Ukraine has very big chances, but we absolutely understand that now we need to choose the right leader who would speak the same language with Trump's team. And thus, this is the question facing Ukraine now.
An entrepreneur is needed. A pure entrepreneur is needed who might one day become president, who will speak the same language as entrepreneurs. Well, America is, after all, a country of entrepreneurs. At the highest level, actually. Well, you know that in America, the ruling class is still the large entrepreneurs. So who are the billionaires there? Entrepreneurs. In Ukraine, these billionaires are embezzlers. These are officials affiliated with the state and businessmen who exploit the country. It's a different approach. And we, of course, need entrepreneurs, then we will develop dynamically. Here's another interesting argument that bots who hate everything in the world always say, wherever America goes, there's war and no dawn. I think, and they always bring up the example. Take Iraq, for instance. Supposedly, they won there. And what about there? I looked it up on Wikipedia and found out that under Saddam Hussein, the GDP was $3,000 per capita. And this is an oil-rich country. Now, after the war and all these transformations, the GDP is already $12,000 per capita. And the most interesting thing, who is the president in Iraq now? No one knows. I don't know either. And who is the president in neighboring countries where there was a dictatorship, like where Gaddafi was? Everyone knew him. So these countries, freeing themselves from dictatorship, go through a difficult path of reconstruction. But freedom brings them money. Previously in Iraq, for example, there wasn't. Their first business started like in any wild country. People began to bring in satellite dishes, sell mobile phones. So it's like starting from scratch. But it also brings democratic processes. And that's why we don't know who the president of Iraq is right now. It doesn't matter. And who is the president of Georgia? Also, there's some president there who we are not interested at all. Some democratic processes happened there. The power shifted in the parliament. There's some political squabble going on, but it doesn't matter. Then they give us an example. Well, it's nothing. The borders are open. If there were two sides, there's one that would like to support the war. Who do I include in them? China, the terrorist Putin, and the same socialist to Europe plus Islamized England at the moment. And on this side, we also have the Democratic Party. This too, I consider, is a party of war. And on the other side, I can say now it will be formed, I think, the UN. What is your opinion? It hasn't fulfilled its tasks. It has never acted preventively to stop the war. It has rather contributed to all of this. It might be that the UN will be disbanded and a new League of Nations will be created. For example, Argentina, America, and likewise Ukraine. The UN works brilliantly. In reality, most people simply do not understand how complex the intergovernmental processes are. At one time, the UN was organized in such a way that 5 countries are particularly equal in it. You know, it's like this. All pigs are equal, but 5 of them are very equal, meaning they are completely equal. These are the nuclear powers that possess the triad. These are the United Kingdom, China, Russia, France, and the United States of America. These 5 countries in the UN have the right to veto. This gives them the ability to block any UN resolutions and, most importantly, to resolve issues with them. Therefore, when these 5 countries come to an agreement, it is essentially the new world government. You could say it's a kind of democracy for the entire world. We need to consider China's interest, undoubtedly. We need to consider Russia's interest, undoubtedly. The war itself happened because the Europeans decided not to consider Russia's interests, to expand NATO wherever they wanted, doing whatever they pleased, and can you imagine, disregarding their neighbors. And in fact, this leads to these major countries having enough potential to control the countries around them. That is, they turn these countries into either friendly ones, or we go to war, or we ignite conflicts. Well, for example, Russia acts somewhat bluntly because it simply starts a war in a neighboring country to keep it in its sphere of influence. The United States of America acts a bit differently as they have more power. For example, Canada hesitated a bit and started aligning with Europe. Well, then you get sanctions. Not sanctions, but increased tariffs. There. Brazil resists something. You get tariffs and so on. They act a bit differently and more humanely due to their size. Therefore, no organization other than the United Nations can exist in principle. Well, firstly, at least consider that its headquarters is in New York, and this suits everyone in America. And essentially, as of today, I think no reform in the UN is needed. 5 countries, I need to come to an agreement. Today, you could say 3 countries are on one side, 2 on the other. And now in Ukraine, there are negotiations underway to satisfy all countries. By the way, when I predicted the future of Ukraine, how this conflict would end, it immediately became clear how to satisfy everyone. Well, to suit Ukraine, but in this situation, you see, they no longer consider it much. It turned out to be too weak. And how to satisfy the 5 main countries that need to agree and pass a United Nations resolution. One way is to satisfy everyone. And then this model emerges for me, where Ukraine will actually have to get these territories back, but with broad autonomy. And this, by the way, will strengthen Russia's position in Ukraine, because it will, to some extent, control the people there politically through federalization. Therefore, such an outcome of the war in Ukraine is quite possible. But when the United States of America entered with the fund, it fundamentally changed the perspective because it was unimaginable, as this fund will be reinvested for 10 years. All the money invested there will not be withdrawn. Some enterprises will be set up, something will be restored, money will be generated and invested over 10 years, and all this without tax. I suspect, since Americans love to work with other people's money, that there will be a very powerful financial department there, which will attract money from Saudi Arabia, from European countries, from America, from businessmen, and from our businessmen. It might even provide an opportunity in 5 years to include Russian and Belarusian businessmen, because this fund will need money. And Ukrainians, in principle, should think like this. Will the money from the activities of this fund go to Ukraine or not? If yes, welcome. We are coming to you.
When I read this program, this agreement, it's really like I'm reading the points of a party one by one. And it turns out that the only thing needed for this is a leader who could implement all of this correctly. And it is also written here that all state enterprises currently on the territory of Ukraine are not included. And the new leader will need to turn them from state-owned to non-state-owned, which is what the party planned. So it can be said that if the right leader does not come, then perhaps all of this will be carried out haphazardly, as they say.
The program states a zero option. That is, there should be no state enterprises. The state should not engage in economic activities, because many people still think, having been caught in the war, impoverished, they somehow continue to believe that the state will take care of them someday. The state merely sets the rules. And in reality, entrepreneurs never care about anyone. Neither do business owners nor shareholders care about anyone. But as a result of properly structured activities, they are compelled to produce public goods. That is what people buy because they have no other source. The state can seize money, confiscate property, impose taxes, and create a crazy customs system. But a business cannot afford that. It is forced to enter the open market and trade and even compete. Therefore, of course, the main position of the party, for example, the Libertarian 510, becomes the zero option, that all 3,500 state enterprises should become joint stock companies at a minimum, if not private enterprises. And this makes us think, by the way, it will incredibly fill the fund of Ukraine, which can create another fund also free of charge, where this money would go for the common good, meaning it would circulate to further clear up the property base of Ukrainians. And this fund can already operate differently, like the pension funds in America. They invest money in the most profitable global brands, and as a result, there are 500 companies where they can invest. In this way, they become stable, preserving the well-being of their pensioners. And for Ukrainians, this welfare fund can emerge precisely from the matrix of 3,500 state enterprises.
Absolutely. And another point of this program states that it is not just an economic program, it also relates to defense. That is, Ukraine can also receive weapons under these points, you see, because it is so advantageous, as Ukraine can receive some defensive weapons, for example, air defense systems or equipment, and it can be credited in the future, then in this fund.
Theoretically, yes. But when we talk about purchasing weapons from the same American, we must understand that we will be spending public goods on weapons. And in this situation, it is always necessary to consider the appropriateness of these weapons.
I meant defense, I meant defensive.
I understood defense. But the problem is that Ukraine will be protected by prosperity and peaceful initiatives. Pacifism and neutrality are more likely to protect Ukraine and its citizens than any accumulation of weapons. Because this international treaty, which will still be between the United States of America and Russia, will sound just like it did in 1973. Remember, back then, the peaceful initiatives of the Soviet Union, with the Americans, and then they signed. At the core of these treaties is always the reduction of nuclear weapons of these countries and the removal of medium and long-range missiles from certain territories. And in this situation, Ukraine falls under these territories because Russia will definitely demand the removal of medium-range missiles from Ukraine and parts of Europe. That is to return to the old treaty. And America will agree to this because it is necessary to establish some zones in the world that are free of weapons. And indeed, for Ukraine, the future is better without weapons.
I mean, Trump, around January 27th, right after the inauguration, stated that in the future he plans to create a golden dome for America there, of course, for long-range missiles. Accordingly, Ukraine can also receive such a dome under this treaty just for protection.
It might be possible if, of course, there is enough money. And the Americans, they love to sell fourth-generation weapons. And this is probably already sixth-generation weaponry. Therefore, our very way of waging war is beginning to change. And now they are showing the world how vulnerable not only cities with millions or 20 million people like Moscow are, but entire countries. Because these exercises, which were suddenly conducted, and I believe they were exercises carried out in Spain, when a blackout disconnected energy facilities from power supplies, but it immediately affected Spain, Portugal, and part of France. And they observed how different bodies interacted with the misfortune that befell them. Well, because they saw how the banking system didn't collapse because there was green energy. It turns out that ATMs had their own energy backup. Banks switched to backup power, and essentially they concluded that a cyber attack on energy facilities is not as terrifying now, at least for the south of Spain. I think they were observing where the weak spots are, because I think they will conclude, why fight when, for example, you can plunge Moscow into a blackout? Well, yes, for a week. And what do you think will happen to Moscow in the winter if it is really plunged into a blackout? It will be a disaster. Muscovites will come out and start looking for Putin and everyone else, what to do with them in the dark. So we are moving to a different level of war, to a different level of threats. And this in Spain, it seems to me, was a threat to Moscow. You can try it this way too. And there is also preparation underway to shoot down satellites, including communication satellites and military satellites. And in general observation, those small satellites that have been scattered around the earth, which you yourself told me about, connected by these lasers. Where did it disappear to?
Alexander Valerianovich, thank you for this interesting and very useful conversation. Thank you for joining us.